Hello and welcome to this edition of Potomac Local Live. We appreciate you joining us. And joining us today is Delegate Lee Carter. He is running to keep his seat in the Virginia House of Delegates. He represents the city of Manassas and Bristow in Prince William County and the Virginia's 50th House seat. Delegate Carter, thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the couple things I want to get into while we have you. First, I want to know a little bit about what you're hearing at the doors. I know you spent some time, as many politicians this time of year do, knocking on doors, getting out your message, talking with the voters. I want to know a little bit about what you're hearing and kind of what you're talking about. From there, I want to get into some of what was sort of a very busy, tumultuous session earlier this year, especially in February, and some of the things that you called for back then and some of the legislation that you had in session last year and where we left off there. And then if we have time, I want to get into the new Picard show because I was scrolling through your Twitter feed and you, like I, am a Trekkie, and I definitely want to get your insight on that because I can't think of anything more important than a great Star Trek show, right? So let's get into it. First, let's talk about your district. You represent, for the past 2 years, you've represented Manassas, right? And Manassas is known for sort of this good old boy style politics where for the longest time, Republicans had control. It was a place where sort of everybody knew their local politicians. It was a family of politicians. Those the current sitting mayor, Hal Parrish, his father was the mayor, and he also served in Richmond in the House of Delegates. You came in 2017 and you rode the quote unquote blue wave and got elected with a new class of Democrats. Tell me, what have you experienced in those past 2 years serving with that new class?
Yeah, Manassas politics have for a very long time had this sort of good old boy network. It's very hereditary. There weren't a whole lot of surprises, but along with that, that was being maintained by an ever shrinking amount of participation from the public. The 50th district had one of the lowest turnouts of any House of Delegates district throughout the Commonwealth historically. This district has a high population of foreign nationals who can't vote, has a high population of children who can't vote. And even among those who were eligible to vote, fewer and fewer people were participating every year. So in 2017, what we were able to do is we were able to go out there and spread our message to people who traditionally haven't voted in General Assembly elections and let them know that they had an opportunity to vote for someone who would actually fight for their interests. And that's how we were able to win, by activating people who historically had not voted.
And what does that look? So paint a picture for me of that voter. Where do they live? Where do they work? What kind of car do they drive? Do they even drive a car? What do they look like? What type of clothes do they wear? Can you paint a picture of that voter that you say you activated in 2017 to turn out for you?
Yeah, that voter who hasn't typically voted, they come from a variety of different backgrounds. You've got people who are dissatisfied with politics as a whole and sort of don't identify with either major party. You've got people who maybe they consider themselves Democrats, but they don't typically vote because they've got 2 or 3 jobs and they're struggling to make ends meet, and they haven't really been able to justify taking a whole day off or a half day off to go vote in the past. It's people who it's young voters, it's working single parents, it's all walks of life, just people who traditionally haven't really heard a compelling reason from either major party why they should take time out of their day on that Tuesday in November to go vote.
So your message in 17 was you, the underrepresented, you, the historically have not been participating in the process. I will then go and represent you in Richmond. How much has your message changed between then 2 years ago and today?
Well, it hasn't. My message from day one was, I'm not a typical politician. I don't come from a normal politician's background. I don't take a single dime from for-profit corporations or industry interest groups. And so I'm fighting every single day to do the most good for the most Virginians. And that's something that I've been fighting for absolutely every day from even before I got elected. And that hasn't changed at all. I'm going back to the voters and I'm saying for the last 2 years, this is what I've been doing. I've been fighting. It's been an uphill fight. I need 2 more years to keep fighting.
You say that you're not a typical politician, and when you came in, you got a lot of headlines for being the state's first, I guess, member of the Democratic Socialist. It's not a party, right? It's sort of an organization, a club, if you will. Explain to those who don't understand exactly what that means. You're a Democratic Socialist. What does that mean?
So I'm a member of the Democratic Socialist of America. I don't use the phrase Democratic Socialist to describe myself because I feel like it's redundant, right? Socialism is defined as an economic system where the people who work in an enterprise have ownership and democratic control over that enterprise. That's it. So we're talking about employee ownership of business, right? And if it's not democratic, then just definitionally it's not socialism, right? So, what it means to be a socialist in politics is, I'm a member of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is not explicitly capitalist or explicitly socialist. It's just an organization. But I'm fighting to make sure that working people have more control over their own lives. And that's in the workplace, at home, and in government. So, which
is a good segue into your bill introduced in this past session, 2019, HB 1806, Right to Work. This got some coverage, right, from statewide coverage, because essentially what you're doing here is you're repealing the provisions of the Right to Work state, right? For a long time, Virginia has been sort of anti-union, right? And so you wanted to come in and allow for people who work for these companies to form unions, which historically in this state has been frowned upon. Your bill was referred to a committee, Commerce and Labor, and then it went on to die, where it was just kind of left on the table. What was the impetus for all this? I mean, this seems to be a big issue for you.
Yeah, we have to talk about, first of all, the name Right to Work is an intentional misnomer. It has nothing to do with whether or not you're going to be able to get a job. So what this law that we have on the books does is, we've had it on the books since 1947, and it allows people in a unionized workplace to freeload off of the union because the union's required to benefit to bargain on behalf of everyone in the workplace, whether or not that person is a union member. And our so-called Right to Work law forces the union to bargain on behalf of those people who then refuse to pay in to what they're benefiting from. Right, and it was put in place in 1947 because the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers were trying to organize a strike at Dominion Power. It was called VEPCO at the time, Virginia, the General Assembly adopted this in 19. We were one of the first states to adopt it after the Taft-Hartley Act allowed us to adopt these sorts of statutes, and they did it specifically to bust up a union at Dominion. By creating a mechanism that would essentially, in those days, stoke racial tension within the union. So it was fear among white workers that black workers were going to freeload off of their union or vice versa, right? So I'm trying to get rid of this. It has a tremendously racist past in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I'm trying to repeal it because it will empower working people to stand together and demand better conditions in their workplace.
So it's fair to say that, I mean, there are unions in Virginia. I mean, one of the ones that we covered a bunch about a month and a half ago is the union that struck at OmniRide, right? We had a 4-day work stoppage at OmniRide strike. 50% of the drivers who drive for that transit system in Prince William County are union members. The other 50% are not union members. So would your legislation force those who do not want to join a union to have to join a union to receive those unionized benefits, the same wages and or health care, for instance, or time off? Would they have to join a union to receive those same benefits as their union co-patrons?
No, the union would still be required to bargain on behalf of everyone in the workplace, but the union would also be able to negotiate with the employer to set up either a union shop or an agency fee shop. And those are, a union shop is everyone who works there has to be a dues paying member. An agency fee shop is, everyone who works there has to at least reimburse the union for their portion of the bargaining that's done on their behalf. But that negotiation is done in each individual workplace between the union and the employer, right? This doesn't mandate anything from the top down. This is just removing the prohibition on those types of contracts. So if an employer and the union come together and agree on an exclusive labor contract, that's currently not allowed, but would be allowed if my bill were to pass.
Another one of your bills that was, again, that died in committee was giving the municipal employees the opportunity to strike. As we know, especially teachers in Virginia are not allowed to strike. Your bill would have extended the right to strike to these employees of state and local government. Were you disappointed that this didn't pass?
I was mostly disappointed that it didn't even get a hearing. There was it certainly seemed like the Republican majority in Richmond didn't even want to have their own members vote on it. There was a lot of fear around that bill. But under current law here in Virginia, we have one of the most restrictive laws on public sector employees' rights in the workplace. And part of that is what I was trying to overturn, which is if any public sector employee goes on strike, they're automatically deemed to have resigned and they're permanently ineligible from ever being a public sector employee in Virginia again. That's unconscionable. We've seen these teacher strikes in other states, in West Virginia, Kentucky, Arizona, California, all over the place. And what it is teachers standing up and saying that the conditions in our schools are so bad that we have to disrupt things to get the attention of the people who can fix it, right? And that's something that we should be praising. If our teachers decide to stand up together and blow the whistle, sound the alarm and say someone needs to fix these things in our schools right now because our children are not getting a quality education, we should be praising them. We should be rewarding them for that. Instead, under current law, we automatically deem them to have resigned, and we say you can't be a teacher again. It's unconscionable. So
these issues, you represent, again, the city of Manassas and Bristow, which is in Prince William County, and are you hearing of these? Are you from disgruntled teachers who work in either school system, the city or the county, that these problems exist in the divisions in which you represent?
This isn't, about a specific locality or a specific school. We do have issues within our schools up here. Certainly not as bad as some other places in the Commonwealth. But this is about empowering teachers, giving them another tool in their toolkit to sound that alarm if they decide that it's necessary. We do have a bit of a crisis in teacher pay. Here particularly in the Prince William area. We're one of the lowest in the region, and we have some of the highest cost of living of anywhere in the country. And so, there are a lot of teachers that are having a hard time making ends meet. It's making retention really, really difficult. Teachers come in, they teach here for a year or two, and then they move on to greener pastures. But this is about empowering teachers, treating them as professionals who know what's best for their classrooms, what's best for their students, and saying, we trust you to be able to make this call and say, if the majority of teachers think that a strike is necessary, if things are that bad, you have the ability to get our attention.
This is an expensive area to live in, one of the most expensive in the nation. Obviously, we're not Silicon Valley, San Francisco, the Oakland. We're not there yet. But there
we're not
is
far
some,
behind.
well, there is some fear that we may be inching closer to that. The Council of Governments in a Prince William County Board of Supervisors meeting last week called for the construction of more housing to offset what is a developing housing crisis. You have went to Twitter and expressed fear that you may not be able to afford to live in your own district, and you were also very critical of not only the Amazon deal, which is Virginia's second largest economic development win, but you were also critical of the Micron deal, the $3 billion Micron deal, which is Virginia's largest economic development win. Talk to us about why you think Micron, Amazon, they're not good for Virginia.
So Northern Virginia has a crisis on our hands, but it's not a crisis of joblessness, right? We don't have people that are sitting around waiting for work and work's not coming. What we have is a crisis of affordability. We have, in fact, more jobs than there are people that do them in Northern Virginia. We have a lot of people working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, and by incentivizing these companies in these extremely high profile deals, we're sending a signal to real estate speculators that you can jack up rent on everybody here because more people are going to be coming. And we've seen that, before a single shovel even hit the ground, we saw in Arlington County an 18% increase in housing prices before Amazon had hired anybody for the new Crystal City campus. And so what you're doing is you're creating a situation where a small handful of people are going to get these high-paying jobs, but mostly those people are either going to be picked off from other high-paying jobs in the area or brought in from outside of the area, right? You've got a parade of U-Hauls coming in. And everybody's rent is going up, regardless of whether they're benefiting from those jobs or not. Right. So we're making things better for a very small handful of people that are already here, for a slightly larger but still small handful of people who are going to be coming here from places like Pennsylvania and New York. And you're making things worse for the overwhelming majority of renters in the area by giving speculators that excuse to drive up the rent. And on top of it, you're making them pay for the privilege through our tax dollars that are going to these massive corporations. We spent $70 million subsidizing Micron's expansion here 9 months after they bought back $10 billion worth of their own stock. And Amazon, of course, they've got hundreds of billions of dollars in cash payments from the Commonwealth, hundreds of millions of dollars in cash payments from the Commonwealth. But Jeff Bezos is the richest man who's ever lived in history. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that the people who are on the losing end of these deals are the ones that are subsidizing the wealthiest people who have ever lived.
But the argument there is Bezos, though he may be very rich, is also creating more jobs, which then in turn create more people to come and pay taxes and to invest their money into local businesses and to spur the economy in the area.
Well, first of all, demand is what creates jobs, right? Not billionaires. Billionaires just move money around to try to profit off of matching up the supply and the demand. So there's a better way to do this. We could have taken that money that we spent on these economic development packages, these bribes that we paid out to these massive corporations to come here. We could have taken that money and used it to try to empower working people to create cooperatively owned businesses, employee-owned businesses. We could have, created them from scratch. We could have created incentives for traditionally investor-owned businesses to convert to cooperative ownership, to put these engines of economic development in the hands of working people.
So that's interesting. Where is the demand for this? And what type of businesses would these be? I mean, obviously the city, Micron already exists in Manassas mm-hmm. City. They wanted to expand. Manassas lobbied for them to expand within its city. It had other options. But when you're talking about setting up co-ops, what do these businesses look like, and who do they serve, and what type of goods do they produce?
So they come from every sector of the economy, right? It's an ownership structure. And it can work with just about any type of business. There are some that currently exist in Virginia. An example that I love to use is the Little Grill in Harrisonburg. It's a diner just like any other as far as the customers are concerned. But what happens is, every so often the employees who work there, they're all equal part owners, and they bust out the balance sheet and the schedule, and they figure out who's going to work what hours and what to do with the money. But the important thing is that the ownership and the decision making are in the hands of the people who are impacted by those decisions.
But when you compare Micron, which is already a large employer, and bringing on 1,100 more high-paying jobs, technical jobs, scientist jobs that will be filled by scientists, as we're told, and you compare that with a diner, are you not comparing apples and oranges?
Well, maybe a better comparison would be Mondragon then. Mondragon is the world's largest worker cooperative. It was founded in the 1950s in Spain. And now it has 87,000 employee owners that operate in 90 some odd different countries. And they do everything from insurance to manufacturing to high-tech R&D. General Motors and Microsoft both team up with Mondragon for a lot of their R&D needs. And in the 60 plus years that they've been in business, they've never had a layoff, because the people who would be laid off are the people who would have to vote to lay themselves off, right? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so by putting ownership and decision making in the hands of the people that work there, you're essentially making this sector of the economy immune to outsourcing and layoffs and all sorts of ills that we associate with corporate greed.
I want to switch gears because we've been talking a lot about your bills. It's been a tough 2 years for you. You haven't you've not gotten a single piece of legislation passed, and many of them have died in committee. Can you talk before we move on to our next topic? I just want to get you to talk about the climate in Richmond, where that has seen zero bills that you've introduced pass or get out of committee.
Well, this is an intentional decision that was made by the Republican leadership in Richmond. They essentially, before I was even sworn in, they just decided Lee Carter doesn't pass any bills, right? I mean, I had a bill that would have changed how you handle pedestrians in a crosswalk, right? Currently, you have to yield for pedestrians in a crosswalk. I wanted to make it so you have to stop for pedestrians in a crosswalk. That got a party line vote in subcommittee. So, that's not stop versus yield is not exactly a hotly contested partisan issue.
So you think you say you've been singled out?
Yeah, and it's a political decision. They think that by not letting me pass anything, damn the consequences for my constituents and even their constituents, they're going to be able to use this line of attack that I haven't passed anything to try to get rid of me.
You also had a bill
but it's not going to be that easy to get rid of me. We're certainly going to see what kind of climate we have after this election. I'm hopeful that we'll have Democratic majorities in both the House and the Senate, and we'll be able to get some of this backlog of bills through.
So let's go ahead and talk about that, because the Washington Post had a story out today that talks about the governor. He's the head of the party, and whereas he was not as well received back in February when a yearbook photo surfaced that presumably was him wearing blackface. Then afterwards, there were calls, including one by you, for him to resign. He's still obviously the governor, and the Washington Post article talks about today the governor is more well received than he was back in early February when that photo surfaced. But yet you weren't the only one to call for his resignation. You, in a tweet, said that he must go. You caught some flack on Twitter for that, because there were a lot of people who agreed with you, but there were also those who called you a Republican for saying that. What the governor is still in office. He did not heed any of the Democratic calls to resign. Does that hurt Democrat chances? And does it hurt your electability chances because you are associated with a party and with so many members who asked him to leave, but he didn't go?
No, he's not on the ballot in 2019. In fact, he'll likely never be on a ballot again. The governor of Virginia is limited to only one consecutive term, so he can't run for re-election in 2021. And frankly, it would take an incredible amount of hubris for him to think that he has a chance at running for something in 2025 or whatever year he would decide to run for another office again.
So you think when he's done with the governorship, that's the end of his political career?
It certainly ought to be. But the big thing is I've called for his resignation. There's not a whole lot that I can do to force him out, as much as I would love to. But frankly, him sticking around is a distraction at this point. But the overwhelming majority of voters know that he's not exactly my favorite person. And so the scandals that he's brewed for himself, people aren't really talking about it that much.
So when you do knock on doors, what are they talking about?
People are talking about how hard it is to make ends meet. They're talking about the fact that their rent is going up faster than inflation. They're talking about the fact that their health insurance is going up faster than inflation. That college tuition is going up faster than inflation. All of these things that we have to pay for are getting more expensive much, much faster than people are getting more money in their pockets.
So what are the solutions to some of these things? I mean, you get reelected. You start looking toward January when the House session reconvenes. What are you thinking about legislatively?
Yeah, so a lot of my bills that I've introduced in the last 2 years are going to be coming back, particularly when it comes to workers' compensation. I've got a bill that says that you can't be fired because you got hurt at work. I think that's a pretty common sense bill, but like I said, because of the partisan makeup down in Richmond, haven't been able to get that to the floor yet, but we will. But also pushing for a healthcare system that guarantees coverage for everyone. We had a massive success on that front with the Medicaid expansion. We got about 300,000 people on health insurance that did not have it 2 years ago. There's still 500,000 Virginians with no health insurance whatsoever, and there's upwards of 1 million Virginians who have health insurance, but it's too expensive for them to use it. So I'm also going to be pushing for a cap on copays for insulin. Because there's too many people that are underinsured and they need insulin because they have type 1 or type 2 diabetes and they can't really afford it, so they're rationing and sort of gambling with their lives. We're also going to push for things to reduce the cost of housing. Things like rent control and good cause eviction laws. And increased investment in community land trusts and cooperative ownership of multifamily housing units. I'm fighting to make sure that the cost of living comes down and wages go up. And you do that by empowering tenants and empowering workers. And a lot of times those are the same people.
Well, I should have asked this when we were talking earlier about the cost of living and with the expansion of Micron and Amazon in the area driving prices up. Since 2016, especially in Prince William County, local officials there have been clamoring for changes in proffer law, right? Which allows them to work with developers to get needed school sites or amenities for fire stations or high schools, elementary, middle schools, to be able to talk to developers, to work out deals, to be proffered these amenities to the county. Whereas a 2016 law ended all of that, right? It actually opened up the county to legal action if it were to approach a developer and ask for anything like that. At last year's legislative dinner at Prince William County, it's an annual thing. They hold it in early December. Us reporters really only go for the food, and it's not even that great, but we go to eat. I don't remember if you were there. I know that there wasn't a lot of appetite amongst Democrats to even talk about that, to address proffer law change. Where do you stand on this? I mean, is this something that you want to help this locality out to be able to come to bring developers back to the drawing board, to the discussion table, I should say, to talk about what this county needs and how these developers, like they have in the past, give school sites, give sites for police or fire stations, and to make it so the county doesn't have to spend its own money to build their own facilities?
Yeah, that 2016 law was actually originally passed because of lobbying efforts by the developers. And then they didn't like the fallout of their own actions, and they started lobbying for a replacement that would be even more favorable to them. And so, I do think that we need to change how we handle the proffer system. But frankly, if the housing developers are the ones writing that replacement, it's probably not going to be something that I'm willing to vote for. But we can have new construction going up in a responsible way that makes sure that we have the housing supply that we need here in the Prince William area. But it's up to the Board of Supervisors to make that happen and to pay for all the things that they've traditionally not been willing to pay for, right? Prince William was one of the most reliant on proffers of any locality in Virginia, specifically because the board under Corey Stewart did not want to pay for things. They wanted to sort of, shunt that responsibility over to the developers. So, there are on both sides of the table on this, between the local government and the developers, they're both bad actors. They both need to just to stop looking at each other as the solution to their problems and just actually get the work done that needs to be done.
So do you plan on any legislation that would address this call for proffer law change, something that your jurisdiction has been calling for the better part of 3 years now?
I probably won't be introducing any legislation to change it. I'd be surprised if someone else doesn't. But whatever comes before me in Richmond when it comes to proffer law, I'm gonna weigh it on the merits of the language that's put in front of me. Mm-hmm. And if I think that the language that's put in front of me is better than current law, I'll vote for it. If I think it's worse, I won't.
One of the bills that you co-sponsored, co-patroned, was Delegate Kathy Tran's bill last year, mm-hmm. and that was amounted by many conservatives to being infanticide. And the governor, whom you say that you're not in favor of, really didn't do himself any favors by going on to WTOP radio and describing the process of a baby who was born and then was essentially left on a table to die. But you supported that bill. That bill drew protests in South Fairfax, which someone who's been doing this for the better part of 10 years covering this area, we see protest in Washington, D.C., we see protest in Richmond, we see protest in urban centers, but when you actually see a protest out in the suburbs, which is rare, that tends to gain attention. It becomes a big deal. So talk about your thought process of supporting Delegate Tran's bill, and do you think it is another one that will come back this year?
Well, look, there was a big propaganda effort by the right around that bill to lie about what was actually in it. What we were talking about with that bill is just changing the requirements for these emergency procedures. Currently they have to get signed off on by 3 doctors to save the life of a pregnant woman in distress, right? There are a lot of places in Virginia where you can't get 3 doctors in the same place at 2 a.m. It's just not possible. So we were talking about mainly changing that requirement from 3 doctors signing off on it to 1. So that's all the bill really did. I think it was a good bill. I'm still in favor of that bill, regardless of what lies are told about it. And frankly, the lies that were told about it were intentionally dangerous, right? There were a lot of death threats that came about as a result of this lie that Todd Gilbert and his allies in right-wing media told.
And death threats too.
That goes on up to the president of the United States. Donald Trump was tweeting about this, but he was tweeting about the lies that were told about what was in the bill, not what was actually in it.
Did you receive a death threat from this? After this was talked about earlier this year?
I've received a lot of death threats over a lot of things. Let me tell you.
But over this bill, did you receive one over this piece of legislation?
Frankly, I get so many, it's hard to keep it straight. I think maybe 1 or 2 off of this one. But I know that a lot of my colleagues did get a lot more. A lot of my colleagues who are not as accustomed to getting death threats on the regular as I am got death threats over this bill.
I'm not going to get that topic is it could be very macabre to get into the type of legislation that brings you death threats. And I'm not going to get into that, but it's very disturbing nonetheless to hear that you received those death threats, obviously. Yeah, I want to completely switch gears from talking about death threats to something that you and I apparently most really enjoy, and that is Star Trek. There is nothing death threats about Star Trek. Personally, I love Star Trek. I have since I was a kid, and today we are now looking at the possibility of a new Picard show. Jean-Luc Picard, personally, I think the greatest captain of Star Trek of all time. Are you excited about this thing? I mean, we've not seen the Star Trek timeline move forward since Star Trek Nemesis. That was the last Star Trek movie that starring Patrick Stewart and then Next Generation cast. Ever since then, the most recent movies have been sort of in an alternative universe, sort of set in the past. Are you looking forward to this Picard show? Do you think it's going to be any good?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's not just Picard. You know, we've also got there's going to be a series of Star Trek shorts that I think are going to be in the alternate universe of the new movies. There's also Lower Decks, which I think is going to be an animated comedy show. And there's a lot of new Star Trek content coming out. I'm really excited. Particularly since the Picard show is going to take place after the Voyager got back to Earth, right? So we saw in the trailer 7 of 9 interacting with Picard there. So I don't really know what to expect from the show, but I'm excited. This is the most new Star Trek content that we've gotten at any one time for a long time.
So I did the nerd math, and I think Star Trek, this Picard show picks up. Picard is in his early 90s, and of course, in the 24th century, I think people live a little bit longer than they do in our time today. But yet here we go, a guy in the 90s. He's the main character of the show. I'm wondering if how much are we really going to see of Picard being Picard, and then how much of the ancillary characters are going to take on the role of maybe take on the role of main character. That kind of worries me a little bit. It's called Picard, but I don't want to see all the periphery characters sort of take the shine away from him.
Yeah, I mean, the formula has never been all about. Well, I mean, the original series was all about the captain, but essentially since Next Gen, it's never been all about the captain. You've got that supporting cast from the Next Generation crew. You've got a lot of Riker heavy episodes, a lot of Data heavy episodes, a lot of Worf heavy episodes. So they named it Picard, which I think is a bold choice. But we'll see. I really don't think it's going to be entirely focused on him. And of course, we've seen elderly Picard before, right? All good things. Yeah.
The final episode of the final two-parter of the Next Generation.
Yep, with the anti-time singularity that was sort of going back and threatening to erase all life on Earth.
Guys, if we're losing you here, just buckle up because we're going to get deeper. So go ahead.
But I really hope that we see a lot of tie-in from the DS9 folks. I actually just recently rewatched the episode where Rom forms a union.
Shocker.
Right. It's lovely. But I think that particularly the later seasons of Deep Space Nine, they really went into a lot of the cultural and political turmoil within the Ferengi Alliance. The Ferengi are this ultra capitalist, greed is good sort of Gordon Gekko society. But you've got folks that are like, hold on, maybe we should let women go out of the house and work. Maybe
and clothe themselves and
clothe themselves. Right. That's sort of a maybe it's not the end of the world if workers aren't completely exploited to the point where they only dream of being the exploiter.
It's interesting you bring up DS9 because especially in the latter season, I think that's some of the best story arcs in all of Star Trek, right? Because for the first time in Star Trek, the show didn't wrap up in an hour, right? We had multiple stories, and today across Amazon or Netflix, I mean the stories are told within whole seasons, right? You start the first episode, and the story wraps, and hopefully wraps by the end of the season. Star Trek DS9 was a pioneer in that, and so it wasn't until after Roddenberry had passed on that we sort of lost this utopian vision of what the future could be, and we got into, as you said, political issues. We got into money. We talked about in TNG, anything you wanted could be replicated. In DS9, they actually traded for gold pressed latinum, which is gold, right? So it was very interesting to see Roddenberry's era of Star Trek, and then after when Michael Piller and Rick Berman came on, and Ira Berman, I believe Ira Berman, one of the showrunners on DS9, and their take on it. And so that's why I also look for Picard to be a little bit different too, because we've seen changes with Star Trek Discovery. There's a lot of people who love Discovery, and there's a lot of people who say this is not the Star Trek that I'm used to, and don't like it. So that's why there's a lot, I think, apprehensive about Picard to see where they're going to go with it.
Right. Yeah. And I haven't seen Discovery yet. I'm holding off on that a little bit. It is. I think it's in the alternate timeline.
I'm fuzzy on that. I wish I could tell you yes, but they're so. I'm fuzzy on whether or not it is. And for those who don't know, the alternate timeline needs to be 25% different. Yes, I'm told you we're going nerd deep here. 25% different than the original Star Trek, The Next Generation, the original movies, because it was a licensing thing where CBS and Viacom had split. But actually, they've actually agreed to come back together now. So that'll be a discussion for another time.
It's just serious news at this point.
It really, and that I could actually pass off as a news story if I did cover such things.
Actually, I think my favorite fan theory to explain the alternate universe is that the Xindi War in Enterprise was not supposed to have happened in the original timeline. But then when they were sort of undoing the damage from the temporal Cold War, they never undid the Xindi attack. Where the probe sort of, killed 7 million people with that, the enormous laser that cut a swath from like Tampa to Caracas.
Right.
And that was never undone. And so, humanity realized the universe was hostile much earlier. And so they built a lot more warships instead of ships of discovery.
Which honestly, I never really liked that, because that Xindi thing was never brought up in any other Trek, in Trek canon. So for Enterprise to come up and say that, yeah, they totally wiped out Florida. Sorry, we didn't tell you. And have it come after Star Trek The Next Generation, it never set right with me. And so it would be, in my opinion, great if that Xindi thing never happened. I wasn't a big fan of that story arc to begin with.
Or, I mean, they could explain the alternate universe as saying, this entire timeline is what happened because of the Xindi attack that was not supposed to happen in the original timeline. If they just officially said that, it would explain a lot.
Delegate Carter, you have explained a lot coming on to our podcast today. I certainly appreciate the time, and thank and good luck in your campaign. Election day is November 5th, and I'm sure the voters and your constituents will see you out in your district in the weeks to come.
Thank you so much for having me on. I do appreciate it.
And that is this edition of the Potomac Local Podcast. We thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you next time.